This fantasy football draft strategy is going to break your league in 2023. Now, I want to be clear before we get into it. This is not a new strategy. This is not just founded by me. I'm not taking credit for taking this strategy right here. This draft strategy has been around for years, really. But what I will say about it is this draft strategy is absolutely 100% underutilized, especially in more traditional redraft leagues. But this is going to be the year that you use it and you are going to break your league. So every year there are obviously no-brainers in every single fantasy football draft. You're talking about guys like Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs. Those type of guys, you already know that they're fantastic fantasy football players, and you are actively trying to target those types of guys. So the first thing that I want to do here in this particular video is I want to look at a couple of those specific types of games from those guys in 2022 and the success that they had on a game log basis. So when we are looking at a half PPR format, and let's just pick Kansas City and Patrick Mahomes for example. So Kansas City threw 651 pass attempts last year, which was the 5th most in the league last year. So when we're looking at Patrick Mahomes' game log, obviously there's tons of great games in there, right? Patrick Mahomes was a fantastic player, and when you look at players who are most commonly on league-winning teams last year, Patrick Mahomes was right up there at the top. He was fantastic last year in fantasy, and he was a great value for where you were getting him in drafts. But let's look at his main target, and obviously that is Travis Kelce. No secret to anybody, he's a tight end, but he's the best tight end in football right now. Now let's look at Travis Kelce's game log. Obviously, tons of great games in there as well. Very, very consistent too. A couple of stinkers in there, but that's to be expected from any specific fantasy football player. Now, what I'm interested in here is finding the overlap in some of those really good games where both Mahomes and Kelce were fantastic in fantasy football. So the weeks that I'm looking at here are weeks 1, weeks 5, weeks 10, and weeks 11. So in week 1, when you combine Kelce and Mahomes' fantasy scores, you had 57 points in a half PPR format from those two guys right there. Fantastic. Week 5, you had 60.5 fantasy points from those two guys combined. Excellent week. Those are types of weeks that will win you a week. Week 10, 49.2 on the lower end for those guys, but still tremendous type of week from two players. And then week 11, they had 60 points yet again. So if you're unfamiliar, this specific strategy right here is what is called stacking a quarterback with a pass catcher on top of them in your fantasy football teams. And this was a great stack last year. You were getting Mahomes in like round 3, 4, and sometimes even round 5, and you were getting Kelce in round 2. So that enabled you to get yourself a top running back, like an Austin Eckler, like a Christian McCaffrey. You could also probably get a really good wide receiver as well. And then when you could combine a 60-point game with an Austin Eckler 20 to 30-point game, you've got 90 points basically from 3 players on your team. Now let's look at last year's quarterback 2.5 PPR, which was Josh Allen. So Josh Allen had what many consider to be a down year last year. He was actually pretty inconsistent when you look at the game log on the screen. There's plenty of boom games because Josh Allen will do that for you, but there was definitely some bust games in there, and that's what makes Josh Allen such a difficult player in fantasy last year specifically, is those bad games. And when you look at his wide receiver 1, Stephon Diggs, same type of deal. He had some boom games, he had some real stinkers last year as well. Buffalo, I would say, probably had a down year last year. But even then, when you're looking at specific weeks, weeks 1, weeks 2, week 6, and weeks 8, combine those two scores. So you had 51.7 from Allen and Diggs combined last year in week 1. 53.5 fantasy points in week 2 from Allen and Diggs combined. 47.2 fantasy points in week 6 for both of them, and 36.4 in week 8. So even though you're not getting as many big games as you were from Kelce and Mahomes, you are still getting really big weeks from Allen and Diggs in certain weeks last year. Now, the problem with those two guys specifically is if you were targeting those two guys on your team last year, it probably wasn't a great idea last year because Diggs was going in round 1. Diggs was a round 1, maybe round 2 at the very latest last year, and you were getting Josh Allen in round 2, 3, 4 at the very latest right there. So you didn't have the same ability that you did with Kelce and Mahomes to go get yourself a top running back. or a top wide receiver as well as those two guys. And that leads me to this. Let's say that you don't want to miss out on those top players like an Austin Eckler, like a Justin Jefferson, like a Christian McCaffrey. Let's say you don't want to miss out on those types of players and you want a more affordable type of stack. Well, let's look at the Minnesota Vikings for that example right here. So Kirk Cousins was being drafted in the back half of most drafts on most platforms in fantasy football last year. So when you look at Kirk Cousins is a pretty consistent quarterback, as you can see on the screen from his game log last year. He did have some pretty good games, but for the most part was hovering around 17, 20 points a game in fantasy football last year. But believe it or not, Kirk Cousins finished as the quarterback 6 last year in fantasy football. Now, obviously, someone's going to benefit from that. And of course, you have the wide receiver 1 in fantasy football last year and this year, Justin Jefferson being the primary beneficiary. Justin Jefferson, as you can see on the screen, plenty of massive games for you. Plenty of consistent games. A couple stinkers, but again, you're going to get that even from the best fantasy football player in all of fantasy football. But let's combine them and overlap them and see if that is a good stack to get as a more cheaper and more affordable stack. So in weeks 1, 4, 10, and 14 is what we're looking at. Week 1, they combined for 49.5 fantasy points. Week 4, they combined for 34.9 fantasy points. Week 10, 42.8 fantasy points. And week 14, 47.3 fantasy points. So as you could see, as a more affordable stack, this is still a very good strategy to go after, because if you're getting 50, 40 points from 2 players combined, that is excellent. Because if you can hit on the right stack in certain weeks, those types of stacks can absolutely win you an entire week by themselves. So obviously at this point, you may be saying, well, yeah, last year was last year. Why is it going to break my league in fantasy football in 2023? So let me tell you what's going on. So if you're like me and you've been watching football and you're obsessed with football like I am, I've been watching football for over 20 years now. And if you're like me, you probably have noticed that there's been quite a few changes in the game of football over that time. You're seeing less big hits. You're seeing guys get injured less from massive hits, specifically over the middle of the field. Now, why is that? Obviously, they're trying to make the game safer, and as a result, they're putting more rules on hitting wide receivers over the middle of the field, hitting quarterbacks in the backfield. You could tackle a quarterback perfectly and still get flagged and still get an unnecessary roughness call. So essentially what this leads to is the quarterback and the wide receiver having so much power in the game of football these days. And as a result of that, the massive change here is the amount of passes teams are throwing in this modern day NFL. Because when we look back to just 5 years ago from last year, just 5 seasons ago, in 2017, there were 0 quarterbacks who threw for more than 600 passes. In 2022, there were 5 quarterbacks who threw for 600 passes, including Tom Brady, who threw for over 700 passes. So those numbers have gone up since 2017, just 5 seasons ago from last year, and they are going to continue to go up because of these rule changes. So as you can see, a quarterback and a wide receiver are more valuable than they have ever been in fantasy football. So stacking a great stack with a quarterback and a wide receiver is a fantastic move in fantasy football right now. So let's look at my top 3 stacks for this year. Now remember, these 3 stacks on the screen right now are my favorite in fantasy football. Not always the most affordable, but they are, in my opinion, going to score you the most amount of points on a week-to-week basis. So obviously you've got Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase as a quarterback wide receiver stack. Even with Joe Burrow's injury right now, he is expected to be the starter in week 1. That is obviously going to be great for Jamar Chase. Those two have a history from college, and they're bringing it into the NFL, and they've been fantastic in their first 2 seasons together in fantasy football. I expect the same thing this year, even with Burrow not being there right now. You can get Joe Burrow in round 3, 4, 5 sometimes in fantasy football, and you've got to draft Jamar in round 1. So you still have a window there where you can still get really good players, but it's not exactly the most affordable, but the ceiling is definitely there. And obviously at number 2, you've got Mahomes and Kelce. Some would argue this is the number 1 stack. My problem with this particular stack is you have to draft these guys basically back-to-back in most fantasy football platforms. You're seeing Kelce go round 1 this year, and you're seeing Mahomes go as early as round 2 this year. So you have to draft them back-to-back in order to get this particular stack. Obviously, fantastic stack right here, but there is going to be plenty of massive guys that you're going to miss out on if you get this particular stack. Then look at my number 3 stack. Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs. I expect them to have a better season this year than they did in 2022. Now again, let's say you fall into the category of you want to have a more affordable stack opportunity so you can maximize your other picks and get yourself guys like Jonathan Taylor, Travis Etienne, Josh Jacobs, Calvin Ridley if you want to, right? You want to go and make sure you get some high ceiling guys earlier in the draft and not have to do this early stack strategy. Let's look at some more affordable stacks this year. Trevor Lawrence, Christian Kirk. Very, very affordable stack this year. You're getting Christian Kirk in round 5. Typically, you're getting Trevor Lawrence in round 6. So you can get yourself a Christian McCaffrey round 1, Justin Jefferson round 1. You can get yourself a Devontae Adams in round 2. Get yourself a Josh Jacobs in round 3 and still be able to get a great stack this year in fantasy football from rounds 5 to 6. You can go get yourself a Kirk Cousins and Justin Jefferson stack. If you've got the number 1 pick with Justin Jefferson, tremendous pick. You pick Justin Jefferson, and then you don't have to worry about taking a quarterback if you don't want to, and you want to target the stack until rounds 10 or 11 typically is where Kirk Cousins is going in fantasy football drafts this year. Excellent draft strategy right there to get those 2 guys. My personal favorite on the list is Aaron Rodgers and Garrett Wilson this year. Aaron Rodgers coming into this New York Jets offense looks revitalized in camp, looks very engaged with the young players specifically, gave salary back. I think Aaron Rodgers is all in on winning with the Jets this year, and we all know he loves to hyper target a wide receiver 1, which in this case is Garrett Wilson, and you can get Wilson in round 2 typically, and you can get Aaron Rodgers all the way back at like round 11. That is my personal favorite stack. And of course, you've got guys like Jared Goff and Amon-Ra St. Brown as well. Amon-Ra typically going in the round 2 area. Jared Goff typically going in the Aaron Rodgers area, round 11 or 12. So when you combine the affordable stacks and some of these great quarterback wide receiver combos with the information that we have of getting more passing volume from each team at each passing year in this modern day NFL, this draft strategy of stacking a quarterback or wide receiver or sometimes tight end in specific situations is going to break your fantasy football league in 2023, and I advise you to get in on this draft strategy. And let's say you're drafting on ESPN and you want to know that particular draft strategy that is going to be the best for you to win in your league in ESPN, click on this video right here.